Welcome, everyone. This is Imagine All the People podcast, where we learn to appreciate our experiences and cherish the bond we have as human beings. I'm your host, Daniel, and today I had the opportunity to talk to Brandon Stanton, who's the founder of Humans of New York.
I was born in a city called Kennesaw, but I spent most of my time in Marietta, where I went to school. And it was a very nice and privileged upbringing. I was very lucky in that respect. And then I ended up going to the University of Georgia, and I was never a very motivated student. I think that's probably an important characteristic or note. I kind of floated through high school. I did pretty well. I went to the University of Georgia, and at that point, I was feeling kind of very lost and uncertain about what I wanted to do with my life. None of the things that the teachers were teaching seemed relevant to me. I felt like before I learned any knowledge and information, I need to have some sort of general idea of what direction I wanted to go in life, and I did not have that. So I ended up just kind of, doing a lot of recreational substances and flunking out of school. Then I kind of entered this period of my life where, I was completely lost. I was living in my grandparents' basement. And that's when I kind of decided to take things into my own hands instead of, getting information from school. I just started reading a lot. I started reading 100 pages a day. I got very serious about educating myself and, learning about the world. I did that for a long time, and I ended up going back to community college with kind of a new perspective on things. I was more interested in gaining knowledge just through intention as opposed to compulsion. I made straight A's. I went back to University of Georgia, made straight A's there. Then I ended up in Chicago. I was working as a bond trader in finance, just kind of fell into that for a couple years. And then I ended up losing that job. And so I was kind of starting over again. And I asked myself a question. The question I asked is that, if money wasn't a factor and I could just, choose what I wanted to do all day long, what would that be? And at the time, it was photography. It was something that I had just recently started doing as a hobby. I really enjoyed it. I was actually going, downtown in Chicago on weekends. I was taking photos of, everything that I could find, and I just loved it. And I just wanted to keep doing it. And so I kind of made a commitment to myself that I was going to find out how to make just enough money to where I could photograph all day long. And that's really where the birth of Humans of New York came from, was this kind of commitment to myself that I was going to figure out some sort of concept that I could just photograph all day long and make a living doing it. And it took a while until I got there, but my first idea and what ended up being the lasting idea was Humans of New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. But back to your point that you made about living in your grandparents' basement. You talked about the distinction very clearly between learning for the sake of learning as opposed to learning to get a degree and then a job further down the line. Can you speak more to that?
Well, the way that education is currently structured is that it's just like it's fed to you in a measurable way where you need the knowledge to get the answers right on the test, to get the scores that will get you the grades that will get you into college. Everything has a very finite end, as kind of, knowledge as a way to ascend the ladder. And I always rebelled against that. I always rebelled against being compelled to do things and read things just because I was being told to. Now, what happened when I flunked out of school and I started reading a lot on my own, I found that I really enjoyed learning about the world. It was enlarging my perspective, it was giving me more of an idea and a direction about things that I would like to do in the world. And so then knowledge kind of switched from being this thing that I needed to achieve these goals that other people were setting for me to being this thing that I wanted just for the sake of it. And that was real, that was real perspective altering. And so, once I flipped it from something being externally compelled upon me to being something that was kind of intrinsically desired, that's when the fire kind of, sparked.
Mm-hmm.
And I got very obsessive about reading. I would read 100 pages a day every single day. When I was in that period, probably the most important thing that I developed in that period was habits, good habits. Because like I don't know, if you read a certain type of book or listen to a certain type of lecture, the information that you get is going to serve you in very specific circumstances. But if you develop the ability to create a habit, to maintain a routine, to discipline yourself, that is something that you can apply to anything. And so, probably the most important thing, even though in the process of reading those 100 pages a day, I was getting a lot of very specialized information, the most important skill by far was the development of the ability to establish a habit, to be disciplined, to make commitments to myself and hold myself to them. Whether it started as reading 100 pages a day, but then I started playing piano an hour a day, and then I started exercising, every single day. I started running every single day. And these were things that I held myself to and I made myself do every single day. I became a very routine and a very disciplined person. You contrast that to where I was when I was a senior in high school, smoking a lot of marijuana, no real structure in my life, just wanted to hang out and have fun. And so, when I flunked out of college, really the most important transformation that I did was I became a very disciplined, habitual person. And that is the groundwork and that is the scaffolding for my present day success. I still carry that with me everywhere I go. And that was really the underpinning of Humans of New York. It wasn't this huge flash of inspiration, it wasn't this great idea that I had. It was this commitment to myself that I was going to go out and work every single day. I was going to go out and photograph every single day. And the discipline to follow through on that, which I developed at this time in my life when I was lost and I needed to build some structure. And so Humans of New York has changed immensely over the past 10 years. It went from pure photography to where I am now. Now that the coronavirus is going on, I'm not even taking photos. My blog is more popular than it's ever been. I haven't even taken a photo in the past several months because it's all about the writing and the interviewing now. So Humans of New York has remained successful through several different iterations of its creative form. But the one thing that has been constant is my dedication to working every single day. Even when I don't feel like it, even when I don't have a boss or somebody that I have to report to that is compelling me to work. And that is what has allowed me to make it so lasting and bring it through so many iterations.
Wow, that's incredible. There's often this idea of embarking on a huge project because of a sudden motivation. But from how you picture it, it seems to be almost like, as I like to think of it, a sword making process where you slowly chisel away at the metal until it becomes a sharp sword. So, as with Humans of New York, obviously you were incredibly interested in starting this project in the first place. But do you still feel that, curiosity to this day as you work on Humans of New York?
Whew, curiosity. You know, I haven't thought hard about that. Um, I think I have a strong desire to create. I think I get a lot of satisfaction from creating something that other people enjoy, that has an impact on other people, that has an emotional impact on other people. That is certainly a drive for me. As far as the difference between kind of having this burst of passion versus this bedrock discipline that you mentioned, I think they are both very relevant. You need both of them.
Hmm.
When you need that burst of passion is when you're first going and things are the most doubtful. You don't have any experience, you haven't created anything yet, you don't have anybody paying attention. That's when you really need this kind of obsessive passion and this ability to get very inspired because that gets you out there and it gets you started and it gets you over that hump when you have the maximum amount of doubt and the maximum amount of insecurity just because you're so in love with the thing that you're doing. And I was very obsessive in the beginning and I was very passionate about it. Where you need the discipline is when that inevitably wears off. And then the only thing that's left is the routine and the commitment to yourself to do it every single day. And what you'll find is that if you're operating from discipline and you're operating from routine, once you get out there and begin and get going with your day, then the passion returns and it comes in spurts and it comes, there comes in moments when you feel it again. But the discipline and routine is required to get over the hump in the morning when you wake up and you don't feel like working that day and there's nobody making you work that day because you've decided to go on a path where you're your own boss or you're an independent creator. That is when the discipline is so necessary.
Hmm. Can you explain a little bit more about how you started Humans of New York and how it blossomed into the project it is today?
I mean, I always say it wasn't this flash of inspiration that I had. It was the result of hundreds of small evolutions built upon, again, the commitment to myself that I was going to get out and do it every single day. I mean, when it started, it was just me stopping random people on the street, very little photography experience. I was just basically putting a DSLR in their face, putting them in center frame, and hitting the shutter button. That was the first several months. And really, what I was developing during that time was less, not so much photography skills, but I was developing the interpersonal skills of stopping a person on the street and making them feel comfortable with this kind of rather strange interaction where I was taking their photograph. Now, through the process of doing this day in and day out, I naturally started having little conversations with the people that I was photographing. And those conversations proved to be much more interesting than the photographs themselves. And so I started taking these little quotes and I would add them to the photographs that I was taking. And the audience my small audience that I had at that time was very receptive and very interested in these quotes. And I noticed that the reception and the impact of the posts that I were putting up had very little to do with the quality of the photograph and almost chiefly resided in the the depth or the hilarity of the words that the person was speaking. And realizing that, I began to focus on the words much more than the photography. And I focused on getting better at learning about the people that I was stopping on the streets. And so these very short conversations that I had turned into longer interviews until eventually, they got to the point where today, I will often spend 1 to 2 hours with somebody on the street interviewing them.
Was there any point along your journey where you looked back at Humans of New York and you realized that in the end it was a successful project?
Um, so as far as so I was in New York. I didn't have any money. I was trying to make this work. It was this crazy idea that kind of everybody thought was goofy, which was stopping random people on the street and taking their photo. I think the moment that I knew I was going to be okay, the moment that I knew that this was going to work, was very early on, and this was a slightly different time. Facebook pages had just come out. Instagram didn't exist. Nobody was using Twitter. Tumblr didn't even really exist yet. So this was very early in social media. And when I knew that it was going to work was when I started noticing names of people who were following my page that weren't friends or family members. These were people who were following my page because they engaged with the work itself. Once I saw that, then I knew it was going to be something big because then I knew it was just a matter of time. It started as just a few people every single day. And then once it got to be, which is not even a lot, like 10 new followers a day that I didn't know, then I knew that all I had to do was keep doing what I was doing, and it was going to snowball and snowball and snowball and snowball. And so that was probably the big turning point. The big turning point for an artist or somebody with a business is when you start to get a following based on the quality of your work and not based on the efforts of your individual promotion or based on you asking friends and family to listen to. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work without an audience to get to the point where you're skilled enough at what you're doing that the inherent quality of the work itself attracts people. And it takes even more work today because there's just so much out there. There's just so much content out there. And I think everybody focuses so much on, oh, I've got to create something, then promote it, promote it, promote it, promote it, promote it. And it's kind of backwards, where you just need to focus on the creation and focus on the work and eventually create something that's so good it's going to attract people, not because you spent 30 minutes making it
Hmm.
and then 30 days pushing it out. Um, the I think the best way to operate under those in that environment when you're working on something and you're trying to make it good enough that you can find, I call it your first true fan. The first person who will engage with your work because of the work and not because of any social obligation
Hmm.
is you've got to constantly look at what you're creating and ask yourself, how can I like it more? What can I do? Like you should never be able to look at your work and say this is as good as it should be. You should always be able to say, how can I make this better? How can I and if you don't have an audience, then you use your own tastes as a guide. You say, how can I change what I'm doing so that I would enjoy it more, so that I enjoy it more. And that's how I did all of Humans of New York. It's like I didn't need critics or an audience to tell me how to make my work better. I just constantly ask myself, how can I like this more? Or how can I like this more? And it's still how I operate today. I will just I will when I'm writing a caption, I'll write out a first draft and then I'll go through and see what I could do to make myself like it more. And then I'll do a second, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth draft. And it's how I approach everything I create. And it's not that you start with some idea of what's correct and what's not correct. You just create something you like, and then ask yourself what you would have to do to make yourself like it more. And then you do that, and you do that, and you do that. And that's kind of been the compass that I've always used.
Hmm. Wow. Now let's talk a little bit more about the content of Humans of New York. Do you have a certain story that has stuck out to you to this day, and something that you look back upon and just really think about?
As far there's just been so many. Some of the stories have raised a lot of money, so those kind of stick out. There was a young man that I met in the housing projects of Brownsville, Brooklyn, that ended up taking me to his school, and we met his teacher and his principals, and we did a whole series on the school, which raised a bunch of money, and we ended up meeting President Obama. So that was, obviously very remarkable. Um, there's been multi-part characters. There've been larger than life characters that I've interviewed, like Bobby Love, who escaped from a prison in North Carolina when he was in his 20s and completely recreated a new identity and came to New York and started a new life and hid his identity from everybody until he was caught 60 years later. There was a Tangeray who was a 76-year-old woman now who was a stripper in the 60s and the 70s. I'm writing a story on her now. So there's been larger to life. I mean, there's just been such a variety. And people who have impacted me for various reasons, whether it just be the wild nature of their story or whether it be because their story led to a much larger impact because we raised money. So that question as far as a specific person is hard to answer, but I would say that it's the stories that have kind of turned into something more deep than a single post.
So I read that you're working on a project with Tangeray, and her story seems so fascinating. Can you tell everyone what her story is and a little bit more about her life?
Tangeray was, I mean, where do I begin? I mean, I've got 80 pages of it. She was a person who, when she was very young, she grew up in Albany, and she went to jail at a very young age because she didn't get along with her mother, and her mother had her thrown in jail for stealing clothes from the house. She got out of jail and basically moved to New York with absolutely nothing and just built this life for herself. And what makes her so interesting is that pretty much everything she's ever done in her life has been involved with some aspect of the sex industry in New York City in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So she is a fascinating character in herself, but she intersected with all of these fascinating characters and elements of New York society. So her stories are just larger than life. And yeah, it's a fantastic tale.
So I've been following you for some time now, and one of the things that I remember was your open letter to President Trump. Um, can you speak more to that and your motivation behind that?
That was context matters. This was very early in gosh, was it 26? It was early in 2016. It might have even been 2015. Um, when the primary was going on. So he was one of several candidates in the Republican primary when I wrote that.
Hmm.
And so, these some of the characteristics of him I pointed out and my objections to him have become very, well trodden and almost cliche things to say right now. But this was very early on when he had just kind of started to speak in his very nationalistic and racist kind of rhetoric. And it was just something that was very bothersome to me. And so, I wrote this open letter, kind of calling him out on some of this stuff, and it just went insane. It was like this was before writing open letters to Donald Trump was a thing,
Hmm.
and so I think it had like 2.5 million shares on Facebook or something crazy like that. It's not necessarily one of the things that I am that I mark as like a significant moment in my career because it was kind of a departure from what I normally like to do, which is to kind of tell stories and stay in the background. So this was a moment where I kind of came forward with like a very
Hmm.
direct kind of personal statement in a way that even though it got so much traction, it got so much traction in a way that kind of diverted from the main thrust of what Humans of New York is, which is telling the stories of other people. So it was certainly a interesting experience. I wouldn't say it was necessarily something that I view as a high point in my career.
Hmm. Hmm. And so obviously that letter and a lot of your posts on social media have gained a lot of recognition. So how do you see yourself affecting direct change in our world?
Well, I think the direct change is probably, I mean, even though the blog has raised maybe $12 million for charity, I mean, there has been a lot of direct intervention and direct impact that we've made. But I would say that that is very small and fractional in relation to probably the more subtle changes that people have from just listening to somebody else's direct experience, and the understanding and awareness that comes from really getting inside somebody else's head and learning about where they come from. That's something that the blog has hopefully been doing on a daily basis for the past 10 years, which is sharing these stories of other people. And so, I think probably the most profound impact of the blog has been in these kind of quieter moments of reflection that hopefully it's initiated and encouraged in people to kind of question their beliefs and question how they see other people around them, and for a moment kind of commune with somebody else in their pain and their struggle and what they're going through.
Now, with what you just said, is that sort of the overall message that you want to convey through Humans of New York? Just the shared story of human beings?
Well, I don't even know if there is an overall message that I want to spread. Like ultimately, I'm getting, going back to what we were kind of talking about of what Humans of New York's built on. Of what was it that got me out there, which was the desire to do it every single day, and that is still my guiding compass. I want to create. It was photography. Now it's more storytelling. I want to tell stories every single day, and I want to tell them in the best way I possibly can. And so when I'm sitting in front of a person, when I'm doing my work every single day, I'm not asking myself what message am I going to spread today? What message am I going to communicate today? I'm asking myself, how am I going to tell this person's story as best as I can? So that's really what I'm aiming to do. Is not put out anything into the world, any sort of message or cohesive argument or anything like that. It's to tell the best story I can, and then do it again tomorrow, and then do it again tomorrow.
And Brandon, I remember calling you yesterday and talking to you about my podcast and how I've been inspired by Humans in New York. But one of the things that we also brought up was this idea of having, I think it's 14 million people right now on the streets of New York City, and yet it's also a city where people feel the most alone and the most depressed. So can you add your stance to that statement and that commentary?
Yeah. It is. It is interesting one, and I think like I think a big cause of that is like the defense mechanisms and shields that people build up
Mm-hmm.
just as a byproduct of 14 million people being in such a small area. It's such a dense area. You're constantly running into people, and there's constant conflict, and there's always two people who want the same thing, or five people who want the same thing, or 10 people who want the same thing. So there's a lot of competition. And so your relation to people is not usually a social one on the streets of New York.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost an adversarial one where you're trying to get to work and there's a lot of people in your way, or you're in traffic. And so you know, our perception of other people becomes one of these people are almost an impediment to me getting what I want or getting where I want to go. And I think to really commune with someone and to really feel a sense of fellowship with someone, you need to. break down that sort of relation. And when you're relating to that person as a thing, as an object, as an impediment, and relate to that person as somebody who's also feeling pain, who's also has a desire and a dream, who's also gone through a lot of struggles in life and overcome through a lot of things. Um, and it's just not something that we have a lot of access to when we are interacting with people on the streets of the city. And I think that's one thing that hopefully Humans of New York has been helpful with, which is stopping, giving these people time, giving them attention, giving them an ear, and really finding out what it is that drives them and where it is that they came from.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point. I'm gonna have to think about that. So now that obviously in the past, I guess, 10, 15, 20 years, there has been a revolution with social media. In fact, that's how Humans of New York started in the first place. How do you see yourself sort of maintaining this evergreen content, or how do you see yourself capturing the current zeitgeist of our society?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing is with this coronavirus, it's become very difficult to approach people on the
Hmm.
streets of New York City. So I've had to pivot and kind of adjust in that way. And so I stopped doing interviews randomly on the street, and I opened them up. I opened up my inbox and asked people to send me stories, and obviously the response was overwhelming. I got thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of stories. And so currently I'm interviewing people very much like this. I will call them and we'll have a video chat. And I am putting together the stories that way, which has been remarkably successful.
Hmm.
All the narratives are very interesting, obviously, because they're not randomized. They're stories that I'm receiving and I'm choosing. And there's been an added element where people have been sending me photos from their lives that kind of illustrate and punctuate the
Hmm.
stories that they are telling. So, where on normal Humans of New York, I might just have a picture of a person on a bench and a story that they're telling. Now I will have the picture of the person, the story they're telling, and about 8 or 9 photos from their past that illustrate that story. So it's a very different experience in a lot of ways. And so that's an example of kind of this unexpected tragic event forcing an evolution in the blog that's actually turned out to be quite compelling to people. So I'm looking forward to exploring that more as the next weeks and months unfold.
Hmm. And now this next question sort of goes along the lines of what we discussed um, prior about the irony of feeling alone in the midst of 14 million people of New York City. What do you feel like is the greatest social problem that our society faces today?
Whew. Yeah. I don't know, man. There's just so many. I guess probably some sort of social cohesion and um, trust in each other, which would be required to execute solutions on all the other myriad of problems that we're facing. I think we're probably just we're so divided right now. Nobody really listens to each other. Everybody's got each other boxed and put into some sort of category, which kind of shuts them down from truly listening to that person. And obviously there's so many problems that it's kind of hard to choose a single one. But without that, without the ability, the willingness to even work together or trust each other, nothing else is going to be solved.
Hmm. So I sort of touched upon this before, but I really love this idea of the cultural zeitgeist. You've had meaningful conversations with people for the past 10 years. How do you see the evolution of our society, and where do you think it's going to go?
Huh, funny. Um, yeah, Billy Corbin, Smashing Pumpkins. I listened to him recently, and he was talking about zeitgeist, and he was talking about how you know the the artists that have staying power, the ones that are able to exist and thrive in multiple zeitgeists. Um, Humans of New York came into prominence during the Obama era when the zeitgeist was very much about things are getting better and we're understanding each other and information will save us and the ability to connect will save us and there's a lot of optimism there and then there was that zeitgeist and that zeitgeist kind of came to an end with Trump and then it turned very political and adversarial and I mean and you can look at just the art that kind of came out of that period if you look at who the late night shows were the ones that were the most political were the ones that were getting the most views the podcasts the ones with the most political were getting the most listens and so we went from this kind of age of tolerance and understanding, or I will say an attempt at tolerance and understanding, to kind of it's not worth trying to understand people anymore. The best thing to do right now is to oppose and to fight. And so we're kind of coming off this adversarial zeitgeist and what we're moving into right now I don't know. It does seem like it's changing once again. I think the coronavirus is going to significantly change our ways of relating to each other. It's going to cause a lot of isolation. And what's going on right now with George Floyd and the systemic racism that's being uncovered and finally understood, and the anger and the protests that are emerging around that it's a time of great upheaval, and I feel like we are entering a new zeitgeist. That's for sure. Um, what that is and what art defines it is yet to be seen.
With that said, do you ever think about humans in New York ever losing traction? I mean, I know it's a horrible question, especially to ask you, but um, do you see it sort of becoming irrelevant, especially when we live in such an adversarial sort of, I guess, like political and social climate, or do you see it as evergreen content?
I mean, I've always wondered if it's going to be. As time goes on, it seems more and more likely that it will be because it has stayed so relevant for so long. I mean, I moved to New York 10 years ago, and the blog now is more popular than it's ever been. There's more people engaging with these stories and commenting on these stories than there have ever been, especially recently. And, I do think that in times when we are so disconnected and isolated from each other, we can't travel, we can't get on an airplane, we can't go visit with friends without putting ourselves and them in danger. There is certainly a vacuum and a need for connection that I think Humans of New York has a small role in filling. And so yes, I mean I can never know.
Mhm.
It's the internet, it's the art world. Things can suddenly become uninteresting tomorrow that were wildly interesting the day before. But from what I've seen so far and the longevity of the work so far, it makes me sense that there is a demand and a need and a desire for the stories of other people that is constant through every kind of change that society might go through, and therefore suggests that the work will be quite enduring.
That's really interesting. Now, before we wrap up, is there anything you would like the listeners to hear, or anything you'd like to say?
We change again. I think change in society is something that's a little bit, more difficult for me to speak to because it's never really been something that I focused on. Some people say that Humans of New York has changed society, but if that is the case, it is only because I focused on making my work as good as it possibly can be. I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to tell the best stories that I possibly could. And anything that has resulted from that has only been a byproduct of the storytelling.
Definitely. And as I mentioned before, the some of the people who I have on Imagine All the People um, are people who I meet on the streets of New York, and it's really incredible seeing your work on such a large scale because it is a hard thing to do. So I just wanted to thank you for it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you for listening to Imagine All the People podcast. This was Brandon, and we hope you will join us for our next episode.